The stadium lights blazed like 1,000 suns against the black canvas of the night sky. 80,000 voices roared in unison, creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. This was Bucharest, Romania, in the summer of 1992, and the Dangerous World Tour had arrived like a force of nature. People had traveled from every corner of Europe to witness this moment, to see the king of pop perform live, to be part of something that transcended mere entertainment and became a shared human experience. Michael Jackson stood backstage, his heart pounding with that familiar mixture of excitement and terror that never quite left him, no matter how many stages he had conquered. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his golden military jacket, the one with the ornate embroidery that caught the light and made him look like a warrior from another dimension. His makeup artist had just finished touching up his face, ensuring that every detail was perfect for the cameras that would broadcast his concert to millions around the world. But perfection, Michael knew, was never about the costume or the choreography. It was about the connection, the invisible thread that would link his soul to every person in that vast ocean of humanity waiting for him. The roar grew louder as the opening notes began to pulse through the massive speaker systems. Michael closed his eyes and took a deep breath, centering himself in that quiet space inside where the music lived. He thought about his mother's word from years ago, when he was just a little boy performing in smoky clubs with his brothers. She had told him that every person in the audience carried their own pain, their own struggles, their own dreams. When you perform, she said, you're not just entertaining them. You're holding their hearts in your hands, even if just for a moment. That responsibility had never left him. It had grown heavier with each passing year, with each million records sold, with each arena filled to capacity. The stage manager gave him the signal. It was time. Michael walked through the darkness behind the stage, his bodyguards flanking him on both sides. The crowd had no idea he was already there, hidden behind the massive structures and screens. They were chanting his name now, a rhythmic pulse that matched his own heartbeat. Michael, Michael, Michael. The sound was hypnotic, almost spiritual. He could feel their energy reaching out to him like waves crashing against the shore, desperate and hungry and full of hope. When he finally appeared on stage, shot up through a trapdoor in an explosion of pyrotechnics and smoke, the crowd's reaction was unlike anything words could capture. People collapsed. They fainted. They screamed until their throats were raw. Security guards scrambled to catch falling bodies and carry them to safety. Michael stood perfectly still, his signature pose with sunglasses reflecting the lights, and let the moment wash over him. This was his gift and his curse, this overwhelming love from strangers who felt they knew him intimately because his music had touched something deep inside them. The first song exploded into life, and Michael moved like liquid electricity. Every step, every spin, every gesture had been practiced 10,000 times until it became something beyond choreography. It became prayer. It became meditation. His feet barely seemed to touch the ground as he glided across the stage, defying gravity and logic. The dancers behind him matched his energy, but everyone's eyes remained locked on him. He was the center, the sun around which everything else orbited. As the concert progressed through hit after hit, Michael felt himself entering that transcendent state where the physical world faded and only the music remained. Sweat poured down his face, but he didn't notice. His muscles ached from the constant motion, but he pushed through. This was what he was born to do. This was his purpose. Every song told a story. Every movement conveyed emotion. Every note carried meaning. He sang about healing the world, about unity, about love conquering hate. And the crowd absorbed every word like thirsty soil drinking rain. Between songs, during those brief moments when the stage went dark and the crew reset for the next number, Michael would catch his breath and scan the audience. So many faces, each one unique, each one carrying their own story. He saw young children on their parents' shoulders, waving glow sticks and smiling with pure, uncomplicated joy. He saw teenagers clutching homemade signs declaring their devotion. He saw older couples holding hands, perhaps remembering their own youth through the music. And he saw something else too, something that always broke his heart a little. He saw the lonely ones, the ones who had come alone, seeking connection in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. The stage crew was professional and efficient, moving equipment with practiced precision. The backup singers waited in the wings, their voices ready to blend with his imperfect harmony. The band never missed a beat, their instruments creating the foundation upon which his voice could soar. Everything was orchestrated down to the second, a massive machine of creativity and technical prowess working in concert to create magic. But Michael knew that magic was unpredictable. It couldn't be completely controlled or contained. Sometimes it emerged in unexpected moments, in the spaces between the planned and the scripted. Sometimes it came from the audience itself, from a spontaneous reaction or an unforeseen event that shifted the energy of the entire evening. He had learned long ago to stay open to these moments, to not be so rigid in his perfectionism that he missed the opportunity for genuine human connection. As he launched into another song, sweat flying from his hair as he spun, Michael felt an unusual tension building in the crowd. Something was different tonight. Something was coming that he couldn't quite name, but he could sense it the way animals sense an approaching storm. The energy had shifted ever so slightly, like a key change in a melody. He didn't know yet that this night would be remembered not just for his performance, but for what was about to happen in the moments ahead. The concert had reached its midpoint, that crucial juncture where energy could either sustain or begin to fade. Michael had just finished an electrifying performance of Smooth Criminal, and the crowd was on its feet, applauding so loudly that the sound seemed to have physical weight. He stood at the edge of the stage, breathing hard, his chest heaving beneath the tight jacket. His dancers had retreated backstage for a quick costume change, leaving him alone in the spotlight for one of those intimate moments he had carefully planned into the show. This was supposed to be the part where he spoke to the audience, where he thanked them for their love and support. He had done this speech 100 times before, in 100 different cities, but he always tried to make it feel genuine and spontaneous. He removed his sunglasses slowly, revealing his eyes to the crowd, and they roared their approval. Some people in the front rows were crying openly, overwhelmed by the mere act of making eye contact with their idol. Michael lifted the microphone to his lips, ready to deliver his carefully prepared words of gratitude. But before he could speak, something extraordinary happened. A woman in the fifth row, perhaps emboldened by the energy of the moment or perhaps driven by demons he couldn't understand, stood up and began to shout. Her voice cut through the ambient noise like a knife, sharp and aggressive and impossible to ignore. At first, Michael couldn't make out what she was saying. The stadium acoustics made individual voices difficult to discern, especially from the stage. But as the people around her began to quiet down, shocked by her audacity, her words became clearer. She was mocking him. She was shouting insults about his appearance, about his changing face, about the rumors and speculation that had followed him for years. She was saying things that tabloid journalists whispered in print, things that cruel comedians said on late-night television, things that hurt him deeply every time he heard them. The woman's voice carried an edge of hysteria, as though she had been holding these words inside for years and they were finally exploding out of her like shrapnel. She mocked his skin, which had lightened due to vitiligo, a condition he had never asked for and tried desperately to manage. She imitated his soft-speaking voice in a cool, exaggerated way. She made gestures suggesting he was strange, unnatural, something less than human. And as she did this, cameras caught every moment, operators uncertain whether to cut away or to document this bizarre interruption. The crowd around her reacted with a mixture of shock and anger. Some people tried to pull her back down into her seat. Others shouted at her to be quiet, to show respect. Security guard began moving through the rows, trying to reach a position, but the density of the crowd made quick movement impossible. And through it all, Michael stood frozen on the stage, the microphone still raised to his lips, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For a moment that felt like an eternity, he said nothing. The stadium had fallen into an eerie near silence, broken only by the woman's continuing shouts and the murmur of confused conversations. 80,000 people held their collective breath, waiting to see how their hero would respond. Would he have her removed? Would he ignore her and continue with the show? Would he respond with anger or dismissal? Michael's hand trembled slightly as he held the microphone. Inside his chest, his heart was hammering. This wasn't the first time someone had mocked him publicly. It happened constantly, actually. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting him as a freak. Comedians built entire careers on Michael Jackson jokes. Strangers felt entitled to comment on every aspect of his appearance, his voice, his choices. The cruelty had become so normalized that even well-meaning people participated in it without recognizing the harm they caused. But standing there on that stage, With thousands of eyes watching his every reaction, Michael felt something shift inside him. He was tired. Tired of the mockery. Tired of being reduced to a punchline. Tired of having his humanity questioned and his dignity stripped away. But more than tired, he felt something else. He felt compassion. Because looking at that woman, seeing the contortion of her face as she shouted her insults, he recognized something familiar. He saw pain. The security guards had finally reached her row. They were preparing to physically remove her from the venue, as protocol demanded. But Michael held up his hand, a gesture that stopped them in their tracks. The crowd gasped. What was he doing? Why wasn't he letting them remove this person who had disrupted his concert, who had insulted him in front of the world? Michael lowered the microphone for a moment, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. She had stopped shouting now, perhaps surprised by his gesture, perhaps exhausted by her own vitriol. For a brief second, their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Or maybe just a simple acknowledgement that they were both human beings, both capable of pain and cruelty and kindness. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. The stadium sound system carried his words to every corner of the venue, but they felt intimate, as though he was speaking only to her. He asked the security guards to wait, to give him a moment. They hesitated, uncertain, but ultimately obeyed. Michael took a step forward, closer to the edge of the stage, closer to the woman who had tried to tear him down. What happened next would define not just that evening, but would become one of the most powerful moments in concert history. Michael didn't defend himself. He didn't list his accomplishments or remind the crowd of his genius. Instead, he did something that nobody expected. He began to speak about pain, about loneliness, about the cost of being different in a world that demanded conformity. His words weren't rehearsed or polished. They came from somewhere deep and true, from that place inside where he kept all the hurt he tried so hard to hide behind his performances. He spoke about being a child performer, never having a normal childhood, never being allowed to simply be a kid. He talked about the pressure of fame, the isolation it created, the way it turned you into a thing rather than a person. He mentioned the vitiligo, the skin condition that had caused so much speculation and mockery, and how it had nothing to do with choice but everything to do with genetics and circumstance. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, emotion bleeding through the carefully maintained composure. The crowd listened in absolute silence. Even the woman who had mocked him stood frozen, her face now showing something different than anger. Michael continued, and his words began to encompass more than just his own experience. He talked about how easy it is to mock what we don't understand, how simple it is to be cruel from a safe distance. He spoke about the pain that drives people to lash out, how hurt people, how we're all struggling with something even if it's not visible to others. Michael's word hung in the air like smoke, visible and tangible, touching every person in that massive stadium. The woman who had mocked him now had tears streaming down her face, her anger crumbling into something raw and more vulnerable. But Michael wasn't finished. He couldn't stop now, even if he wanted to. Something had broken open inside him, a dam that had been holding back years of accumulated pain, and the flood couldn't be contained. He began to pace across the stage, the microphone cord trailing behind him like a tether to reality. His movements had lost their choreographed precision and become something more desperate, more human. He spoke about the tabloid magazines that stalked him, the photographers who hid in bushes outside his home, the journalists who wrote lies about him without a second thought because a scandalous story sold more copies than the truth ever could. His voice rose slightly, not in anger but in a kind of desperate plea for understanding. The cameras capturing the concert had stopped following the planned shot list. Directors in the control booth made split-second decisions to stay tight on Michael's face, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was a man removing his armor in front of the world, showing his wounds, refusing to hide behind the sequins and moonwalks that had made him famous. Michael talked about what it meant to be called strange, to be called weird, to be treated as something less than human. He spoke directly to the woman now, his voice softer but carrying clearly through the sound system. He asked her what had hurt her so badly that she needed to project that pain onto someone else. He asked her what she was running from, what she was afraid of. His questions weren't accusations. They were invitations, gentle nudges toward self-reflection. The crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a celebrity responding to a heckler. This was something profound, a moment of genuine human connection happening in the least likely of places. People in the audience started looking at each other differently, seeing not just fellow fans but fellow human beings, each carrying their own invisible burdens. The woman's neighbors, who had been angry at her for disrupting the concert, now looked at her with something closer to sympathy. Michael's own tears had started flowing now, tracking lines through his stage makeup. He made no attempt to hide them or wipe them away. He spoke about his childhood, about being pushed into the spotlight before he could understand what it meant, about his father's harsh discipline and impossible expectations. He talked about learning to dance to avoid being hit, about perfecting his craft out of fear as much as love. These were stories he had never shared publicly, details he had kept locked away in the private corners of his heart. The stadium had transformed into something resembling a church, a sacred space where confession and redemption became possible. Michael spoke about how success and fame had not brought him the happiness everyone assumed came with it. He talked about the Neverland Ranch he had built, his attempt to create the childhood he never had, and how even that had been twisted by cynics into something sinister. Every sanctuary he tried to create became a target for mockery and suspicion. He addressed the loneliness of being Michael Jackson, of having millions of fans but so few real friends. He spoke about not knowing who to trust, about people who wanted access to his money or fame rather than caring about him as a person. He described the exhaustion of always having to be on, of never being able to go to a grocery store or take a walk without it becoming a spectacle. His words painted a picture of a gilded cage, beautiful from the outside but imprisoning nonetheless. The woman in the audience had sunk back into her seat, her head in her hands, sobbing openly. But she wasn't the only one crying now. Throughout the stadium, people were wiping their eyes, reaching for tissues, holding on to each other for support. Michael's vulnerability had created a permission structure for everyone else to acknowledge their own pain, their own struggles, their own moments of cruelty toward others. Michael's voice grew quieter, more contemplative. He talked about how we're all connected, how the pain we inflict on others ultimately comes back to hurt us too. He spoke about the children he loved, the innocence he saw in their eyes, and his desperate wish to protect that innocence in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. He mentioned visiting sick children in hospitals, seeing their suffering, and feeling helpless despite all his wealth and fame to take that pain away. He addressed the rumors directly now, the whispered accusations and tabloid headlines that had plagued him. He spoke about how lies repeated often enough begin to sound like truth, how reputations can be destroyed by speculation masquerading as journalism. He talked about the cost of defending yourself, how every denial sounds like confirmation to skeptical ears, how silence is interpreted as guilt. It was a no-win situation, he explained, and the exhaustion of it was overwhelming. The audience listened with rapt attention as Michael described the burden of representation, of being a black entertainer who had crossed over to mainstream success and the complicated dynamics that came with that. He spoke about being criticized by both black and white communities, never quite fitting in anywhere, always being too much of one thing and not enough of another. He discussed the skin condition that had lightened his complexion and the cool irony of being accused of wanting to be white when in reality he was dealing with a painful medical condition. Michael's hands gripped the microphone stand now, knuckles white with tension. He talked about the pressure of being called the king of pop, of having to constantly top himself, of knowing that one misstep could bring the entire empire crashing down. He spoke about the fear that lived inside him, the nightmares about being forgotten or, worse, being remembered only for the mockery and scandal rather than the music. The production crew backstage had completely abandoned the planned show schedule. The stage manager stood in the wings, tears running down his own face, making no move to hurry Michael along or get the concert back on track. The band members had emerged from their positions, watching their leader bare his soul in a way they had never witnessed before. Even the hardened security guards, trained to remain emotionally detached, found themselves moved by what they were hearing. Michael began to speak about forgiveness, about how holding on to anger and hurt was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. He talked about choosing compassion over judgment, understanding over condemnation. He looked directly at the woman again and told her that he forgave her, that he understood she was hurting, that her cruelty came from pain and not from evil. His words were a balm, spreading to the crowd like healing medicine. The woman stood up again, but this time not to mock. She raised her hands in a gesture of surrender and apology, her mouth forming words that couldn't be heard over the distance but whose meaning was clear. "I'm sorry." Michael nodded, acknowledging her remorse, validating her humanity even as he had just laid bare his own vulnerability. Something miraculous began to happen in that stadium, something that transcended the normal boundaries of a concert experience. Michael's words had created a space where transformation became possible, where 80,000 strangers suddenly felt connected by invisible threads of shared humanity. The woman who had mocked him was no longer an antagonist in this story, but rather a mirror reflecting back the capacity for cruelty that exists in all of us when we're hurting badly enough. Michael started to sing, but not one of his hit songs. Instead, he sang softly, almost a cappella, a melody that seemed to emerge spontaneously from the depths of his soul. It was part hymn, part lullaby, part prayer. The band members scrambled to follow along, improvising accompaniment to this unexpected moment. The song was about healing, about finding light in darkness, about the possibility of redemption even in our worst moments. His voice, that incredible instrument that could hit notes most singers couldn't dream of, carried every ounce of emotion he had just expressed in words. The crowd began to sway together, a unified movement that looked choreographed but was entirely organic. People put their arms around strangers, creating chains of human connection that stretched from the front rows to the cheap seats in the back. Cultural barriers dissolved in that moment. Language differences became irrelevant. People who had come from different countries, who spoke different languages, who held different beliefs, all moved together in a rhythm that transcended their differences. Michael walked to the edge of the stage and knelt down, reaching toward the audience. The security guards tensed, worried about crowd safety, but Michael waved them back. Hands reached up toward him from the front rows, not grasping or demanding, but offering support, offering love, offering recognition of his humanity. He touched as many hands as he could reach, making eye contact, sharing a moment of genuine connection with each person. The woman who had started this entire sequence had been making her way toward the front, helped along by others in the crowd who now understood her not as a villain, but as someone who needed healing just as much as Michael did. When she finally reached the barrier separating the audience from the stage, Michael saw her. Their eyes met again, and this time there was no anger, no mockery, no defensiveness. There was only recognition, two wounded souls acknowledging each other's pain. Michael gestured for the security guards to let her come closer. They hesitated, unsure if this was wise, but something in Michael's eyes told them this was necessary. The woman approached the stage edge, tears still streaming down her face, her entire body shaking with the force of her emotion. Michael knelt down again, bringing himself to her level, and reached out his hand. She took it, her fingers wrapping around his, and for a moment they simply held on to each other. No words were exchanged in this moment. None were needed. The woman's face showed everything she was feeling. Shame at her earlier cruelty, gratitude for his forgiveness, recognition of her own pain, and hope that healing might be possible. Michael's face showed compassion, understanding, and a kind of peaceful acceptance that seemed to radiate outward like light. The cameras captured this moment from every angle, and those images would be replayed millions of times in the years to come, each viewing carrying its own power. When Michael finally released her hand and stood up, something had fundamentally shifted in the stadium. The energy had transformed from excitement about a pop concert into something deeper, more meaningful. People weren't just fans anymore. They were participants in a shared experience of vulnerability and healing. The woman returned to her seat, but she was changed, and everyone could see it in the way she carried herself, in the softness that had replaced the earlier hardness in her face. Michael returned to the center of the stage and picked up the microphone again. His voice was hoarse now, roughened by emotion and the intensity of what he had just shared. He spoke about the power of forgiveness, not as an abstract concept but as a lived reality. He explained that forgiveness wasn't about excusing harmful behavior or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about refusing to let that hurt define you, about choosing healing over holding grudges, about recognizing that we're all flawed and all deserving of grace. He talked about his music and why he wrote the songs he did. Songs about healing the world weren't just catchy pop anthems to him. They were prayers, wishes, desperate hopes that his art could make some small difference in the overwhelming darkness of the world. He spoke about seeing poverty and suffering during his travels, about feeling helpless despite his fame and fortune to solve these massive problems. But he had realized, he told the crowd, that change doesn't happen through grand gestures alone. It happens in small moments, in individual connections, in choosing kindness over cruelty one interaction at a time. The stadium erupted in applause, but it wasn't a screaming hysteria from earlier in the concert. This was different. This was reverent, appreciative, transformed. People were clapping not just for a performer, but for a fellow human being who had shown tremendous courage in his vulnerability. The sound was thunderous, but also somehow intimate, a collective expression of gratitude and understanding. Michael's dancers returned to the stage, unsure of how to proceed. The carefully planned show had been completely derailed, and nobody knew if they should continue with the scheduled performances or if something else was needed. Michael looked at them and smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and nodded. The show would go on, but it would be different now. Everything was different now. The band launched into the opening notes of Man in the Mirror, and the choice felt perfect. This song about self-reflection and personal responsibility had taken on new meaning after what had just transpired. Michael sang with an intensity that seemed to channel everything he had just experienced, every emotion he had just shared. His voice soared over the crowd, powerful and pure, carrying the message that change begins with looking at yourself honestly, acknowledging your flaws, and choosing to be better. The crowd sang along, 80,000 voices joining with Michael's in a chorus that seemed to shake the stars themselves. People were crying openly now, not from pain but from the cathartic release of deep emotion. Strangers hugged each other. Friends held hands and swayed together. Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders, wanting them to remember this night, to carry this message forward into their own lives. As Man in the Mirror reached its climactic final chorus, something happened that nobody in that stadium would ever forget. The crowd's voices grew stronger, louder, more unified than Michael's own. 80,000 people were no longer singing along with him. They were singing for him, with him, through him. Their voices created a wall of sound so powerful that it seemed to have physical substance, a force that could move mountains or change hearts or heal wounds that had festered for years. Michael stepped back from the microphone and let the crowd carry the song. He stood at the center of the stage with his arms outstretched, his head tilted back, tears still flowing freely down his face. His makeup was ruined. His carefully styled hair had fallen into his eyes, sweat soaked through his elaborate costume, but in that moment he was more beautiful than he had ever been in any polished music video or magazine photo shoot. He was real. He was human. He was, finally, truly seen. The woman who had mocked him was singing louder than anyone around her, her voice raw and broken but full of conviction. She had arrived at this concert carrying years of her own pain, her own disappointments, her own feelings of inadequacy that she had tried to manage by tearing down someone who seemed perfect and untouchable. But Michael had refused to remain untouchable. He had descended from his pedestal and met her in the messy, complicated space where real humans live, and in doing so had offered her something more valuable than any entertainment could provide. He had offered her redemption. When the song finally ended, the stadium didn't erupt into applause immediately. Instead, there was a moment of profound silence, as if the entire crowd was holding its breath, reluctant to break the spell that had been cast. Michael lowered his arms slowly and looked out at the sea of faces staring back at him. In that silence, understanding passed between performer and audience that transcended anything that could be put into words. Then the applause began, starting as a rumble and building into a roar that seemed to go on forever. People weren't just clapping their hands. They were stomping their feet, shouting, crying, laughing, expressing every emotion at once in a release that felt almost holy. Michael bowed deeply, holding the position for a long moment, showing respect to the audience that had just shared something profound with him. When he straightened up, his smile was radiant despite the tears still on his face. The concert continued, but everything about it had changed. Each song now carried additional weight and meaning. When Michael performed Heal the World, it wasn't just a pop song about making things better. It was a mission statement, a blueprint for how individual moments of compassion can ripple outward to create larger change. When he danced through Thriller, the zombie movements took on new significance as metaphors for how we can be reanimated, brought back to life from our emotional deaths through connection and forgiveness. Between songs, Michael continued to speak to the crowd, but his words were no longer just thank yous and expressions of love for his fans. He was teaching, sharing wisdom earned through his own suffering, offering insights that came from having lived through extraordinary pressures that would have destroyed lesser people. He talked about the importance of authenticity, of refusing to let others define you, of finding your own truth and holding on to it even when the world tries to convince you that you're wrong or strange or too different. The woman who had mocked him stayed for the entire concert, but she was transformed. Her neighbors, who had been angry at her earlier, now included her in their circle. They shared snacks with her, offered her water, treated her with the same compassion that Michael had modeled from the stage. This small act of community, this choice to welcome rather than exclude, demonstrated that Michael's message was being received and acted upon in real time. As the concert approached its conclusion, Michael performed an extended version of Oath Song, his environmental anthem that mourned the destruction of the planet. But tonight, the song took on additional layers. It became about all the ways we damage each other in our world, about the urgent need for healing on every level. When he sang about what we've done to the earth, he might as well have been singing about what we do to each other with our cruelty and our judgment and our refusal to see each other's humanity. The performance built to a devastating climax, with Michael on his knees at center stage, his arms raised toward the sky as if pleading with the heavens himself for mercy. The screens behind him showed images of war, poverty, environmental destruction, cruelty in all its forms. But then the images shifted to show hands holding hands, people helping each other, children laughing, nature reclaiming damaged spaces. The message was clear. Despair was not the end of the story. Hope remained possible if we chose it. When Michael finally took his final bow and left the stage, the crowd remained. Nobody wanted to leave. Nobody wanted this night to end. People stayed in their seats, talking to strangers who had become friends, processing what they had experienced, trying to understand how a concert had transformed into something that felt more like a spiritual awakening. Security guards who were normally tasked with clearing the venue quickly after shows found themselves joining in these conversations, sharing their own reactions to what they had witnessed. The woman who had mocked Michael waited near the stage entrance, hoping for a chance to speak with him again. She wasn't sure what she would say, wasn't sure if he would even see her, but she needed to try. When Michael finally emerged, surrounded by his security team and handlers, she called out to him. To everyone's surprise, he stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, then walked over, waving back his protective entourage. They spoke quietly, their conversation private despite the crowd of people trying to overhear. Nobody knows exactly what was said in those few minutes, but witnesses reported that both were crying, that they embraced, that Michael gave her something from his pocket, possibly a necklace or some small token. When they parted, the woman's face showed a peace that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside. Michael nodded to her once more, then disappeared into the night, back to his hotel, back to his complicated life, back to all the pressures and pain that awaited him. But something had shifted that night in Bucharest, something that couldn't be undone. Video footage of Michael's response to the mocking woman spread across the world in the days and weeks that followed. This was before social media, before viral videos, but the story traveled nonetheless, passed from person to person, broadcast on news programs, discussed in living rooms and coffee shops and schoolyards. People who had never given much thought to Michael Jackson as anything more than a pop star began to see him differently. They began to understand the cost of fame, the loneliness of being unable to simply be human without every action being scrutinized and judged. The woman, whose name was never publicly revealed out of respect for her privacy, reportedly changed her life dramatically after that night. She became an advocate for mental health awareness, speaking openly about her own struggles with depression and anger that had led her to lash out at someone who didn't deserve it. She talked about how one moment of being seen, really seen, by another person had begun her journey toward healing. She credited Michael with saving her life, not through his music but through his compassion when he had every right to respond with anger or dismissal. For Michael, the concert in Bucharest became a touchstone, a reminder of why he did what he did despite all the pain that came with it. In interviews afterward, he would reference that night when asked about dealing with criticism and mockery. He would explain that hurt people, that responding to cruelty with cruelty only perpetuates a cycle that benefits nobody. He spoke about the power of forgiveness not as weakness, but as the ultimate strength, the refusal to let someone else's pain become your poison. The 80,000 people who were in that stadium carried the experience with them into their own lives. They told their children about it. describing not just the incredible music and dancing, but the moment when a superstar chose vulnerability over invincibility. Those children would grow up with a different understanding of what strength looks like, what courage means, how power can be used for healing rather than domination. The ripples spread outward in ways that couldn't be measured or quantified, but were nonetheless real. Years later, after Michael's death in 2009, footage from that Bucharest concert will be watched by millions on YouTube and other platforms. New generations who had never experienced his live performances would discover this moment and be moved by it. Comment sections would fill with people sharing their own stories of being mocked, being hurt, finding the strength to forgive. The moment transcended its original context and became universal, a testament to the enduring power of choosing compassion over cruelty. Music critics and cultural historians would point to that night as a pivotal moment not just in Michael's career but in the broader culture's understanding of celebrity and humanity. It challenged the assumption that famous people existed primarily for our entertainment or judgment. It reminded people that behind the spectacle and the fame was a person with feelings, vulnerabilities, fears, and hopes just like anyone else. The boundary between performer and audience had dissolved in that stadium, revealing the fundamental truth that we're all just humans trying to navigate this difficult world as best we can. The legacy of that night in Bucharest extends beyond any one person or any one moment. It lives on in every act of compassion chosen over cruelty, in every instance of forgiveness offered when anger would be easier, in every moment someone chooses to see another person's humanity rather than reducing them to a caricature or target. Michael Jackson, through his music and his message, but most powerfully through his example that night, demonstrated that transformation is always possible, that healing can happen even in the most unlikely circumstances, that love really can triumph over hate if we're brave enough to choose it. The woman who mocked him taught an unintentional lesson that night.